Welcome to the second session of our conference. It's a great pleasure to be able to welcome Professor Simon Buckingham Shum, who's recently come from the Open University to the University of Technology, Sydney. So that's a win, then, at least in terms of landscape. Simon is Professor of Learning Informatics, and he's our learning analytics guru for the conference and can guide us through the complexities of this emerging and ethically complicated field. He's come to Sydney to be the director of a new Connected Intelligence Centre, which will prototype and research new ways to advance deeper learning using computational analytics and socio-technical infrastructures for collective intelligence. And if you can say that, you are not drunk, which is good. Simon is effectively central to the emerging field of learning analytics, presenting at multiple conferences on that subject. He's the co-founder for the Society for Learning Analytics Research, the Compendium Institute, and Learning Emergence Network. He's co-edited Visualizing Augmentation and Knowledge Cartography, and I'm delighted that he's here to talk to us this afternoon. Simon.
Oh, thanks very much, Sue. This is all going to sound painfully familiar. Hi, my name's Simon. I'm from England, and I want to use my own machine as well. It's great to be here, I'm not yet 3 months in Australia from the UK, but we've just about unpacked the cardboard boxes, and my kids are now in school, so I've satisfied some duties. It's great to be here and to share with you a learning analytics lens on this theme of personalisation. Hopefully I'm going to show you a few things that you haven't seen before, just to spark discussion. And I think I'm going to be picking up on some of the themes we've already heard this morning around student agency, helping students take responsibility for their own learning, creating students who are ready for a very complex world, assessment regimes, and how we can evidence the kinds of qualities that we are talking a lot about and put them on a really strong evidence base. We're going to be talking about educators' worldviews as well. We'll be talking about students' dispositions and mindsets, but also educators' dispositions and mindsets. We've had quite a lot on that already. I'll be talking about how we can create evidence bases for these qualities at different scales. So here's the take-home message if you're ready to go to sleep after that very good lunch. If we're going to think about the role of data in personalisation, this basically requires us to reflect deeply on our epistemology, pedagogy, and assessment. And that can then shape an analytics strategy around personalisation. So I will be unpacking what I mean by that. So let's just think about what is personalisation in a very simple way. The learner is giving off signals of some sort which you, the educator, interpret and adapt your behavior accordingly. Okay? You might be doing that in a tutorial group. You might be doing that with your PhD student one-on-one. Might be a little harder to do in an audience, but if I saw all your heads just going like that, I might adapt desperately to try and do something. If you're in a lecture theatre with n-100 students and your pre-prepared lecture, well, you're probably just going to stand and deliver it regardless, right? Even though the students are all down looking at their mobile devices and doing goodness knows what. Okay, but that's basically what we mean by personalisation, and of course that can take many different forms. So a learning analytics approach to this would be to say, okay, how do we scale this? In particular, how do we do mass personalisation, which of course has transformed so many other sectors of society? How do we use the digital data traces that students are leaving? How do we use different kinds of computational techniques to analyse that, visualise that in the right way, to the right people, in a timely manner? Right? We know that timely, formative feedback tuned to the learner is one of the most effective ways to improve learning. But that often takes expensive human beings, and they're a scarce resource. So let's swap that now with the learning analytics cycle. This is a figure from Doug Clow at the OU. Again, very simple. We have learners who are emitting signals, but now they're leaving data traces. Someone or something is trying to make sense of those using different kinds of metrics or patterns that say, I'm seeing this in the data, that means something important, and we're going to try and do something about it and make an intervention. Okay? So starting from Doug's picture, I just backed out and said, well, actually, that's just a machine version of what we do as humans. But then we need to start putting our critical hats on and asking, okay, well, learners, or what kinds of learners are we talking about? What kinds of learning are we talking about here? You cover a wealth of disciplines which cover many, many different kinds of things. What data are we talking about here? What could we extract from that learner experience? How is it being cleaned? We talk about cleaning data, but cleaning data can mean all sorts of things, and you might be throwing out baby with the bathwater. Do you have a theory of learning, even if it's theory with a small t, which tells you that you should be looking for certain kinds of patterns? What analytical tools could actually be capable of looking at the data for those patterns? And how are we actually going to render that in a form fit for human consumption? And do people need training to understand these things? Are we talking about the educators? Are we talking about the business intelligence unit? Are we talking about, gasp, the student themselves? Receiving timely feedback in a way that they never had before. And then who's going to make an intervention? Is the human going to see, the educator sees something on their dashboard and they are then going to do something? Is the software actually going to step in and make a recommendation autonomously without human mediation? What kinds of ethical issues does that raise? You get a green light all the way through and then fail. Could you sue the university because the system told you were doing well? And if that's a cycle for any particular learner in a particular learning context, we're also thinking at UTS and with the global networks we work with, how do we scale that up further? So here's the same cycle again, but now we're talking about scaling this for systemic educational improvement across an institution or even amongst partners. So the U21 network, for example, could be using an improvement science cycle. This is working with Tony Breik at the Carnegie Foundation and Stanford. You have many people building a shared picture of the problem they want to solve. Students unable to write good academic English, remedial maths, low socioeconomic students failing to complete the first year. You build a picture of the shared problem you have and what we know about what works and doesn't work. You then deploy different kinds of innovations in different learning contexts and universities. You are sharing data and evidence back, both quantitative data and qualitative. We're then bringing human and machine analytics to bear on that, which leads to various kinds of sense-making, which then improves the evidence hub, may update our picture of the problem and what works. Okay? So that is an improvement science strategy for improving practice in a community of practice, all interested in certain problems. So whether we're talking about this kind of thing, or a machine-based or human and machine-based learning context, or a community of practice, this is the kind of cycle we're going through, and this is where data and evidence and real-time analytics could mean a step change. But it's not just about cool machines, algorithms, and visualizations. What I'm going to argue is that your notion of personalization, and by extension analytics to support that, is fundamentally tied to our educational worldview, and we've been touching on that this morning. So what do we mean by that? So teaching and learning always takes place inside, the magic triangle of epistemology. What do you think it means to know something in your field? And to assessment, how are we actually going to evidence that you can display those competencies? Pedagogy, how are we actually going to go about scaffolding the learner on that journey, right? And when in learning analytics, we talk about being in the middle space of learning sciences, education, technology, analytics, computation, and there's a middle space in the middle where we want to talk about how the two intersect. Well, this is another middle space that we've talked about in this journal paper here. So what epistemological assumptions are shaping an assessment regime? If you're going to sit students down for 3 hours in a closed exam, that says something about what you think it means to know something. If, like in Denmark, your high school students can sit their exam with networked computers, where you're not worrying so much about them regurgitating the correct facts, but about their ability to forage, synthesize, and craft an argument, that says something about what you say, what you think it means to know. It changes your assessment regime, etc., etc. Another way of picturing this, and this is a way of picturing what we've been talking about this morning. There isn't a right or wrong here, but this is the comfort zone. Content, expert-led teaching from a prescribed curriculum. And we can stretch along the dimensions here. Actually, I've had a bit of my slide chopped off. Or we can go up here where the curriculum is less and less fixed. And one of the arguments by most educational thought leaders is that we are moving into greater complexity, greater uncertainty, greater ambiguity, more voices who have different views about what used to be considered to be correct, the truth, the source of authority, and students have got to be equipped to cope with that, whether or not they're going into further academic study or employment. And employers are complaining that students are not equipped to cope with thinking on their feet, asking critical questions, working with people who may be very different from themselves, etc., etc. All the rhetoric around 21st century skills and competencies. Here's another picture. So if that's arguably the ability to move around that space fluently is perhaps another way of describing Simon's 21st century teacher, where you've got to have the ability to design learning experiences which are fit for purpose. And that could be many different kinds of things. And this is where most academics and most schools are, but some of them are moving in this direction. And there are ways of scaffolding that and assessing that. If we're talking about equipping learners to tackle complexity, we think about this. This is with my colleague Ruth Deakin-Crick from Bristol, who's also a visiting professor at UTS with me. Operating at many levels, a learning system, a university, and a learner are a complex system. And we need to start with, who is the learner? We've talked about identity and learners personalizing content and being able to connect it to who they are as a learner, their life story and where they want to go. If you look at the Stanford2025.com site, the opening quote there is, at its best, a university helps me discover who I want to be. All right, it's deep stuff. And as we move out from experiencing and moving into different ways of knowing, that these are different ways of knowing down the right-hand side, we're moving from the personal to the public, and gradually the assessment regimes will change as we move from who am I and where do I want to go out to being a competent member of a community of practice, wherever I choose to be. Knowledge, skills, and understanding is what we know in great detail and depth. We don't know so much about attitudes, mindsets, dispositions. We'll talk a bit more about that now. So I haven't even talked about analytics really yet. I'm just talking about the fact that we can't begin to talk intelligently about analytics until we have, also dealing with issues like assessment regimes and mindsets. So, for example, at Stanford, at the Learning Analytics Summer Institute last year, we ran a workshop called Dispositional Analytics. How do we tap into the way in which a learner approaches their learning? Are they risk averse, or do they relish a challenge? Are they curious, or do they just like to be told what to think and what to do? Or do they push back? And we also talked there, Chris Goldspink from INSEP Labs talked about teachers' dispositions. So he's been working in South Australia with the Department for Education there, studying school teachers, right? But these are the people who are preparing your first years, right? And it turns out that school teachers, after studying them in great detail, using a systematic observational methodology of 500 teachers, they characterized two archetypes. The ones in blue, they called those teachers who are able to be like dynamic designers. And you can see how they were scored with the blue spider diagram on a whole bunch of qualities and competencies, versus those who what they called script-driven. They know what they want to teach, they're going to do it, they can't take on board student feedback very much, they can't improvise very well, and and they're actually quite unaware of their own worldviews and assumptions. Whereas teachers who are the dynamic design archetype are aware that they're making assumptions and commitments, are trying to get students to surface those assumptions and commitments. So they just have a much more sophisticated epistemology about what it means to teach and what it means to learn. So, you know, if we're thinking about using data and analytics to deal with personalization, the teacher is going to create the conditions for that. And this is a way of starting to get at that. And that's from INSEP Labs here in Sydney. And we're working closely with Chris Goldspink on that. And there's a link up there which you can chase down later. And if we look at some of those competencies, the ones in red there are particularly to do with personalization. Teaching students how to negotiate learning and how to learn more effectively, exploring the construction of knowledge, connecting what they're teaching to the lives and aspirations of their students, and using much more authentic learning and assessment. So we can start to quantify some of those hard to quantify things. So our design of analytics is going to vary dramatically depending on which part of that space we think we're in. So for example, if we are in the realm of teaching students how to master some very well understood rudimentary skills, we can use adaptive tutoring, intelligent tutoring as it used to be called. Carnegie Mellon's work with the Open Learning Initiative and their tutors, you know, they've demonstrated the impact of using an algebra tutor in combination with a blended learning mode. Students were learning at least as well, if not better, in a whole semester's material in half the time, when they were going off, getting a personalized learning journey, and then meeting to discuss in groups. Right? The tutor is better than a human at giving personalized feedback at scale on how well you've mastered certain well-understood skills. Or you go to grokkit.com. This is where you can prepare for your GRE exam in the States. Right? Very fine-grained feedback on my verbal abilities here, contrast, continuation, sentence completion, analogies. You know, there's my dashboard. You know, I'm getting finer-grained feedback than I'd ever get from a human, probably. Right? So if that's the part of the quadrant we're in, then learning analytics has got a particular story to tell. But that may not be very good when we're talking about other kinds of embodied, situated, socially rich competencies. Another kind of analytics, right? LinkedIn knows an awful lot about me. LinkedIn Labs generated actually what I thought was a very good picture of my professional life. They couldn't label the clusters. I had to do that myself. They haven't quite got that clever. But, you know, that's my world, right? And they are recommending people and groups to me based on their analysis of my world. And who knows, one would expect LinkedIn probably to be moving into the learning space pretty soon if you're looking for a disruptive technology. You know, once LinkedIn University or training suddenly kicks in, we'll probably be all a little worried as well, because they really know how to use social and semantic network analysis. Here's another example. If we're really interested in the kinds of social learning networks that a student can form, here we are not just filtering on a social graph because I happen to have replied to somebody, but we're filtering on a social graph filtered by topic. What are we talking about? In this case, the semantic web. And we're filtering on different kinds of social ties. Did I friend them, follow them, respond to them, or interact with them in some other way? For example, annotated an artifact that they had shared. If I change the social ties, then the social network changes. So my friend network, my follow network aren't necessarily the same. So social network analytics can start to feed back. I don't know if you'd use that in summative assessment, but as formative assessment tools, we can generate visualizations to provoke reflection by students. And these kinds of technologies, you know, that's a research prototype. But if you go to somewhere like declara.com, people are trying to create social learning environments that feel a bit more like Facebook and have that conviviality. But now we're going way beyond just social. Now it's getting semantic and predictive analytics. So these guys have architected a system from the ground up for scale, for predictive modeling, a recommendation engine, and so forth. And when you go browse around their site, you'll see them talking the language that you see in many other sectors like health insurance, marketing, etc. not because we're treating students like that, but because the underlying technologies are very similar. You know, there's an architecture diagram that shows that, you know, they're processing content and indexing it, they're doing semantic search, they're providing personalized recommendations. So the technology is invading the education space, but as I'm trying to emphasize, no one's really going to use that very effectively until they've got a well-developed idea about how they want to use that to achieve some pedagogical end. Surveys, we all know what surveys are about. So, you know, that's quite esoteric, emergent technology, but it's becoming mainstream. If we just think about surveys, we're developing an analytics platform which will allow many survey tools to be put together so you can then triangulate the results and build a rich picture of a student. So this is work by Ruth Deakin-Crick from Bristol. She has a research-validated instrument which asks students to reflect on how they approach their learning. So you fill in the questionnaire. How much is this, you know, I often look back and think about what I've learned. Not at all like me, a little bit, quite a lot, or very much like me. And, you know, you fill the questionnaire in, but it doesn't, your results don't then just disappear into a black hole. You immediately get feedback as a visual analytic, designed to provoke reflection and stimulate change and help you take responsibility for how you approach your learning. So in this case, we are now quantifying students' mindsets, students' dispositions. Okay? And if I just step quickly around what these things mean, we're talking about mindful agency at the top. So we talked about agency quite a lot. This turns out to be, when you do the structural equation modeling on this, this is a primary driver for many of the others. Mindful agency, taking responsibility for my own learning over time, defining my purposes and understanding, managing my feelings, you know, that sense of panic when you don't think you're ever going to get it. Adults have that too. Knowing how I go about learning and planning my learning journey carefully. Sense-making, a word that the Institute for the Futures that's their #1 competency for what they're considering work skills for the future. Sense-making, the ability to make sense between what I'm seeing now and what I already know, to see patterns in data. Link my story and my purpose to this curriculum that they're asking me to master. Creativity means being playful with ideas, holding ideas loosely, being willing to take a risk and be playful. Curiosity, wanting to get beneath the surface and find out more, always wondering why and how. Belonging, one of the most highly predictive factors in success, say in remedial math, is whether I feel I should be in this math class at all. So when Tony Bright has a diagnostic question asking people struggling with maths, do you feel you belong in this maths class? And it's highly predictive of whether they go on to complete or not. Right? So that sense of belonging, and we all try and do that with our first years, etc. Collaboration, knowing when to work with others and knowing how to work with them, and knowing when it's also good to work on your own. Hope and optimism, right? This is quite deep stuff. It's about identity, my sense of where I can go in the future, the sense that I can learn and achieve over time, having what Carol Dweck at Stanford calls a growth mindset and believing that I can get better at learning. It's not just some God-given fixed quality that I'll never change. And together, these all sort of culminate in a sense of how open to learning are you? Sorry, it's dropped off the bottom of the slide. There's a sort of a scale of being open to learning from closed to sort of dependent at the other end. Okay, so this is work which is has been going on for the last 10 years at least, and there's a huge data set underpinning this, and this is just from a survey. So we might now ask from an analytics perspective, okay, so we've heard the students self-report, and how they think about themselves turns out to be incredibly important. What about behavioral analytics? Could a machine generate a visual analytic like that based on your behavior? So not just what I say I do, but what I actually do. And so we might want to think about collaboration skills. Well, if we have social network analytics and indices of how I worked in a team, and the extent to which I have initiated and engaged and established mutual reciprocal relationships, that's getting at that collaboration quality. Or sense-making. How would we quantify the idea that a student is able to see connections between important related material? Well, if we were in a more social, user-generated content environment, the way in which I tag and share resources reflects what I see in those resources. If I tag a picture very differently from my peers, if I share something from philosophy with the astrophysicists, that reflects something about the connection making I can make. So we might ask ourselves, how do our online environments help us pick up proxies for these kinds of higher order qualities? Or curiosity. Do I question and argue? How do I search? So we're doing research at the moment on whether your search behavior reveals your epistemic mindset. What does it mean to find the answer to a question? What do you do when you find sources which are mutually conflicting? So when we look at the kinds of talk that goes on between students as they search and discuss results, that could be a window into the mind of the student, which gives us insight into their epistemic capacities. I'll give you one more example, which is around writing. So we're about to move quite heavily into writing analytics because everybody I'm talking to at UTS has got issues with students not knowing really how to put together proper writing. We work on this with kids from kindergarten upwards, and we still have undergraduates coming in who really don't understand how to become a member of a community and write in an acceptable form. And you would expect to see within the literature all these kinds of references, okay? But argumentation is something we're particularly interested in because it's really one of the hallmarks of educated writing. And a few quotes there which I won't read out, but essentially students often completely underestimate the importance of this compared to simply sharing the correct facts and demonstrating they've mastered curriculum content but are unable to master and marshal different sources into a coherent narrative. So we're very interested in whether we could provide rapid formative feedback to students on drafts, for example. And we have, for example, been working with Xerox, who have a very interesting parser, which includes a rhetorical parser. And it looks for categories such as these that you would find in scholarly writing. Okay? Now, if you don't know how to signal to the reader or the reviewer that you are making rhetorical moves of this sort, you'll never get published, because that's what it means to make a contribution to the literature, right? And it turns out that you signal that you're making, for example, open questions. You will use constructions like these, or contrasting ideas between two authors. You might use constructions like those, okay? So to what extent can a machine pick up these very, these are higher order constructs. It's not about, are they talking about the right concepts? Have they got a section called introduction, one called methodology, and one called conclusions? This is a different order of parsing, right? So for example, it's a little fuzzy, but you can see here that on a piece of writing, the parser has classified that as a statement around novelty, okay? And here it's classified that sentence as one to do with contrast. Rather than attempting to provide a dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum, our approach has been to, right? So the parser is looking for certain constructions. It's not canned text. There's a grammar associated with these moves based on linguistic analysis of different disciplines, rhetoric. Or here's another one from student writing. The problem with this method is dum-de-dum-de-dum. Another problem with this method is, in conclusion, I would suggest that such a method would be. Okay? Now, if you got formative feedback from a parser on draft writing that said, we can't find a single statement to do with identifying the problem, or normally you would summarize your conclusions and claim at the end, and the machine can't find any instances. Doesn't mean you didn't, but might be pause for thought. Okay? So this is the kind of scenario we're interested in. Or if we look at analytics on text chat, okay? Can we identify in a 2.5-hour webinar where the most productive, deeper exchanges happened? And did they correlate with where the presenters hoped those might happen? So you can train a classifier on human annotated examples. But what does good look like? So you need a theory of the role of language in learning. So we're in this case building off a professor of education at the OU, who then moved to Cambridge, Neil Mercer, who talked about what exploratory talk looks like. different kinds of challenge, different kinds of evaluation, extending others' contributions, right? Not just agreeing with people and affirming them. You start to push back. You start to offer ideas for debate. You take on board somebody else's contributions and then build on it. Those are the kinds of discussions we love to see in Blackboard and Moodle and so forth. So you train a machine and say, look, here's 100 examples of good, here's 100 examples of bad. Can you infer the features that differentiate them? That's how a machine learning methodology works. And the machine basically has a go. And then we wanted to figure out, well, how would you visualize that in an interesting way? So what you see here is a visualization of 2.5 hours text chat, where the longer the bar, the more confident the machine was about its judgment. Tall red means it's confident that it's seen some exploratory talk. Tall blue, or low blue, means it's confident it's seen examples which aren't terribly exploratory. And with between 70 to 80% accuracy, training a number of different algorithms, the machine did not a bad job. So as you'd expect, people are being friendly and sociable at the beginning and the end, but there's no really deep exchanges going on here. But if we zoom in on one of those tall red peaks, then what you see, and it's not come out very well on the slide, are people using constructions that we might recognize as exploratory talk, where they're saying things like, I wonder if, dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum, I take your point. I'm also wondering, I'd also like to point out. And they're using constructions which make your thinking visible, and I'll show you, you're basically doing knowledge building with language, which is what you do with text. Okay. So I've just given you those examples to hopefully perhaps disrupt the stereotype that analytics has to be just about very low-level kinds of behavior and not what higher education's about. Well, actually, I think analytics has got some things to say about higher education. These are the kinds of personalized formative feedback we can imagine giving students in the future. Within your universities, you will have people who are statisticians, machine learning people, language technologists, who it may never have occurred to them that they could turn their talents to work on your own students' data. But given the right encouragement, you have the capacity to start harnessing these kinds of technologies, and suddenly those academics and researchers get a new status within your university as well. Suddenly they're contributing to strategic core business, so it's something to think about. So here's the summary then. I think that personalization requires us to actually reflect deeply on our own practice. Because as soon as you start talking about personalization, you have to deconstruct what it is that you're actually doing, which many educators have never really done. They think that teaching is like going to a conference and giving a paper. So our design for analytics for personalization is going to vary dramatically on what it is you think you're going to count. What is that machine looking for and counting? And who's it going to show it to, and how are they supposed to act on it? And in other talks, I have deconstructed the pedagogical and the epistemological assumptions that we make with analytics technologies in much more detail, but I've just hinted at it here. I think that analytics for assessing authentic 21st century skills and dispositions is a real frontier challenge for us now. We've talked about the need to shift our assessment regimes to something which is actually going to make it worthwhile for students to choose from a glorious potpourri of personalized learning avenues. But if in the end they're just sitting the same old test, why would they bother? It's only when they've got to display competencies in authentic, socially rich, embodied, politically charged, stressful situations, whatever is appropriate for your context, that we are going to be really making it worthwhile for them to step outside of their comfort zones, and for them to make it worthwhile for our educators to bother, perhaps. So very briefly, just what we're doing at UTS. If you ever see Shirley Alexander, the DVC for Education and Student Speaking, she will show you slides like this around our Learning 2014 strategy, which is rapidly about to become out of date. But fear not, we have a plan, right? So, you know, there's a whole UTS model of learning. Students are sent a YouTube video that says, when you come to UTS, you're not going to be learning the way you learned at school, probably. It's going to be very different. And we try and really foreground that they're going to be doing a lot of work on their own, they've got to take responsibility, they may be working in groups, etc. We're talking a lot about graduate attributes, which is UTS speak for 21st century competencies and skills. And then the Learning 2014 program has been a joined-up program of staff development so that they can make use of the kinds of flexible spaces that we are creating now for learning and teaching. So students all over campus can access hubs like this for doing group work. No more traditional lecture theatres. All the lecture theatres have seats where you can turn around and do group work. So there's no excuse for a lecturer to complain that he couldn't really do that. Lots of flexible spaces as well here. So you need to create the conditions where it's easier to not just stand and deliver your standard lecture. But of course, staff development has to go hand in hand with this. And as we move through Learning 2020, which is embedding the systemic change you need, timetable systems, could completely strangle all innovation, right? Lack of staffing models. What kind of recognition do you get for actually bothering to change your practice? Towards what we're calling learning futures, where we are doing transdisciplinary courses, which cut right across faculty silos. Personalised learning and getting increasingly industry and problem-based. And in big, bold letters up the side here, how are we going to be really smart with data and analytics to enable that journey? And the reason I'm here is because we've created KIC. And KIC is trying to work in a very human-centered design way with transdisciplinary thinking around learning analytics, but also about how our researchers might make use of language technologies, network analysis technologies. Of course, we work closely with our IT and our business intelligence people who are sitting on all sorts of student data, but are interested in how that data could be expanded with finer-grained real-time process data. And we are running our own courses, briefings, as well as master's level courses in data science. So do take a look at KIC. And if you're interested in learning analytics, then come next month to Sydney, where we're hosting the National Learning Analytics Summer Institute. There we will have Gregor keynoting, but also Anne Young from Newcastle, bringing in a business intelligence and planning and quality kind of perspective, because those two camps have got to be in close dialogue. So I'll stop there, but I hope that's provoked some thoughts which you can take forward around the tables. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Simon. That was astonishing. We have 20 minutes for questions. If you have a question, please wait until the mic arrives, because otherwise you're not recorded by the live recording device. So however loud you are, please wait for the mic. Who has questions for Simon? Graham.
Yeah, thanks very much, Simon. Just referring back to your comments to Tony Brick a couple of times, one thing Tony says in terms of the improvement science is that we sometimes collect too much data, and in fact he encourages us to collect relatively small amounts of data, particularly in surveys, relatively short surveys. I just wonder, in relation to everything you've shown us, whether there are some key things that are pointers towards learning that we can take out of that in relation to the sort of things that Tony's talking about.
So we're in discussion with Tony about this. He's quite excited about the potential of learning analytics to add to the improvement cycle. What I'm taking from Tony's work is the commitment to translating what's known within the educational research literature, but which many practitioners never ever get sight of, translating what's known about a particular persistent problem that's of common interest and distilling that into simpler representations. For example, he has a representation called a driver diagram. So if you're trying to improve persistence in students working in maths, there's a huge amount of research around that, but how do you distill that into a very simple representation that allows a community of practice to agree that this is a good summary of what they know, and can then go off and try different kinds of innovations in their contexts, gathering agreed kinds of data so that we then have a basis for comparing and contrasting. The other powerful thing I like about Tony's work is that he takes context very seriously. You know, in improvement science, you don't expect a best practice to translate smoothly from one university to another, or even from one faculty to another. Context is very, very important. And you expect stuff to fail, but the point is you try and figure out why, so that you can then figure out what the, you know, what the DNA of the effective practice is that can be then localized. So basically, the idea is that from these improvement cycles, that figure I put up is that within a university, you can have a community of practice who are all working on something they all share in common, like, for example, improving critical writing, argumentation, trying stuff out, but it's not just 101 random experiments. You are trying to join dots and learn together systemically. And machine analytics and machine level data is a new entrance into the old paradigm of educational social science research, which was survey-based.
Hi, Simon. Thought-provoking as always. When I was at the University of Sussex, one of the biggest problems I had was with a small group of people who called themselves learning advisors. But they were actually failed social workers, if you could imagine such a thing. And the issue came to a head when I had a meeting with them, and they said, the issue is students don't know they have a problem until they come to see us. And I nearly fell off my seat. So my anxiety seeing one of, particularly the spiders' webs that are getting into areas of mental health, is that students are going to see this and then think, my goodness, I have a problem because I can't collaborate. I mean, how do you guard against students over-interpreting a machine analysis of their behaviour?
Right, so yes, this is actually getting at deeper aspects of who am I as a learner. The spider diagrams I was showing you are based on a survey tool. So what it's actually doing is reflecting back to the students what they've said about themselves. That's then the basis for reflection. The way that the work has been done so far, and we're talking about with children, adults, educators, people interested in workplace learning, and people from many different cultures as well, including indigenous cultures here, is that seeing that picture can be absolutely transformational for somebody. It can allow you to see something that was invisible before, and if you feel that it's saying something true, then you can go to work on it. So that's arguably our job as educators, is to give students a picture of themselves that they can then do something about. Of course, if you did the spider diagram and got a very shriveled up little profile, that could be worrying. But the idea is that you then have a coaching conversation with your mentor, your coach, the lecturer, who of course understands how to use this tool, and that allows you to take ownership. And it may be that you don't feel that that's actually a true reflection of yourself, and you might have a conversation about that. So it's not a score, it's not a mark, it's not a grade. Your graduation or your promotion case should not depend on something like that, otherwise you'll game the system, and we've lost the plot at that point. The point is to engage with it honestly in order to learn something about how you approach your learning. Now, I then started to explore whether you could actually generate that as a complement from behavioral traces. And again, if the system came back and said, Simon, we're not seeing a very strong score on your curiosity and critical thinking, because we can barely find any instances of you asking questions in that discussion forum. And in the writing, you very rarely contrast ideas. All you do is summarize it. Okay, just to take the two examples I showed you, right? I've got something I can then reflect on, right? It might be the machine's made a mistake, so we have to think about how machines are going to give feedback without overstepping the mark. And it may be, you know, when I talk to some people, the educators say, that is brilliant, that is amazing, but I'd like to mediate the feedback when I get that from the system. So there are different scenarios and use cases on how automated that feedback might be. But yes, of course, you might get a student with mental health issues who, you know, who is freaked out by seeing a mirror of themselves in that way. We will always have students with mental health issues. But my view is that we cannot make progress on some of these dispositions and mindsets and ability to cope with complexity and uncertainty unless we have people who have a sense of confidence and self-awareness about themselves as well. Otherwise, we will stay at the level of assessment that we know and love around knowledge and skills, which we assess in the current paradigm. So there's risks, but the experience is overwhelmingly people find this very, very productive to see.
I know you've referred to Dewey in your work on his influence on kind of the whole development of learning. And one of the things he talks about is the importance of being able to see ourselves, which I think you're talking about the analytics being able to do. Right. And by doing that, making very fundamental changes in how we perform. And can you see your approaches to analytics being able not only to trigger that kind of fundamental change in how a student may be performing, but also remeasure to see what the fundamental change looks like?
Yeah, so there are two ways of thinking about this. I mean, one is that some people are very, very nervous about the idea that analytics will be assessing in any kind of high-stakes summative way. But making visible processes that until now have been invisible, like social network structures, like, like dispositions, making those visible and generating visualizations to provoke reflection is one approach. Some people aren't happy with that. They don't want to just see a visualization. They want the system to make a diagnosis. So I don't want to just see the symptoms. I want to know, is this dysfunctional? Or how do I compare with other people? Or what do the highest performing students do? And should I emulate them? That then introduces some other worries that, well, the high-performing students can sometimes perhaps, hang on, you're sharing my IP with the rest of the class. Hang on, that's what makes me a super student, because I've got really effective study practices, and now you're sharing the way I search the library with everybody else. There's an interesting one, you know, a riposte being, you've joined a community of learning here. We're a learning institution. We will do all we can to squeeze meaning out of data to improve not just your student experience, but everybody's and future generations. So that's the contract. And that's the sort of statement that a university might make around its data and analytics going into the future, perhaps. So, of course, once you can measure and visualize, you can time sample and show the change. So if you do that learning disposition survey again, you would get a superimposed profile that hopefully showed that when you'd really been working on your resilience or your ability to push back and dig deeper and ask more probing questions, you'd made a change. However, that's fraught too, because when we're talking about a self-report questionnaire, which is about how much insight do you have, you might be getting more and more self-aware and hence more and more modest, right? So my little story is, what if you gave the Dalai Lama that test? Would the Dalai Lama come out as a tiny little dot in the middle or a fully inflated balloon? Right? So the point isn't how big is it necessarily. The point is, am I able to learn from this and figure out how I'm doing and what I might do better? Right? Which is a very different kind of assessment and a very different kind of analytic from the ones that people normally talk about. So we have to treat these things with care as well. But I think Dewey, I hope, would enjoy something like this, because it's about making me more aware of who I am and what my processes are and what my weaknesses are, but hopefully in an actionable way rather than just telling me, you know, this is your personality type, deal with it. You know.
Thanks, Simon. We've talked a little bit about this in the past, but I thought I'd just throw it out there. A lot of the work that is done in analytics is sort of predicated on the notion of trying to detect, and you sort of touched on it just in your response before, trying to detect a deficit, some sort of problem, some sort of pathology where people got it wrong, sort of. You don't do this so much, and you didn't do that so much in this talk. But a lot of it is about trying to determine that. So I wanted you to reflect on the flip side of that, which is what are analytics telling us about modelling for success? And again, you touched on that in the response just before. And let us know what you think about modelling for success rather than modelling for where students are going wrong or going off on the wrong path. And I suppose bringing it back to the conference theme, what does that mean for personalisation? If we're trying to model for success where there's many ways to succeed, but there might be only a couple of ways where you go off the path.
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, how do we do analytics for extremely high achievers that will stretch and challenge them further? How do we make their patterns visible to others, maybe? And in particular, when we're talking about creativity, innovation, curiosity, thinking out of the box, how do we stop condemning the one on the edge to just trying to pull them back into the middle again because they're an outlier, right? So the tyranny of the norm is something to be very wary of with analytics, because, you know, maybe if I was shown that social network diagram and I think out of the box, but, you know, I'm perhaps only interacting with a few other people who I've strategically chosen as being ones I particularly want to engage with, but I'm out here, you know, and now that's made visible to the class, and now I'm now being rendered as some social misfit. Well, you know, so there are very interesting ethical issues around visualization as well, and whether you disclose identity or not, or whether you just show someone where they are in relation to the rest, but no one else gets to see them. But then you could probably figure out who somebody was, because, oh yeah, he always talks to Fred and John, you know. So really interesting issues. So, you know, when I talk to the people at UTS who are in our design, arts and creativity programs, you know, it's quite challenging thinking about what analytics might offer them, because their students are all off doing quite unique, distinctive subjects. You know, it's not a production line in the traditional sense. You know, so I think about, okay, well, are these students supposed to be also demonstrating the ability to reflect on what they're doing and tie what they're doing in their projects back to the body of literature, etc.? If that's the case, and they're supposed to be writing or presenting, well, then we've got text material we can work with. But it's more challenging in those kinds of areas. So, yeah, let's not get focused on just trying to catch the students who might otherwise drop out, but let's focus on how we stretch and challenge the very high achievers as well.
We've got time for a couple more questions if people have them.
Yeah.
Good. That's two.
Yeah.
Thanks, Simon. I'm interested in your view of aggregated data within a cohort, let's say, or a large group, as opposed to an individualised view or perspective, and the usefulness of an aggregated view for a cohort in terms of feeding back to a cohort or a class some aggregation as opposed to an individualised perspective.
Yeah, so for example, the spider diagram, you can generate aggregate statistics that says, and this is proven very useful, for example, you'd show the class teacher, look, all your students have done this, and they really don't see themselves as being very curious. They've said they don't really see themselves, you know. That might, when you've got an individual, that's one thing. When you've got 30 students all saying that, that gives you greater confidence. So, of course, aggregate has greater, you know, power in that sense. So that can be very useful. You know, if you look at, you know, some of Blackboard's material, for example, or any of the learning management system dashboards, you know, they all come with an analytics dashboard now, generally counting pretty low-level stuff like logins and submissions on time and so forth. You know, often they'll say, here's the line for the student, and here's the line for the cohort. So it might be helpful for the student to see that they're doing very well with respect to the cohort. is it going to be motivating or crushing to show the student that they're dismally below their cohort on every scale? Right? Our job is to try and motivate and encourage, as well as challenge and stretch. And so when we think about the effect that one of these representations is going to have on a student, then, well, the only way to find out is actually to do participatory design, prototyping, getting early feedback from students. That's the approach that we plan to take at UTS, you know, and get a sense from them. What do they consider acceptable, unacceptable, demoralizing, encouraging, creepy? You know, I mean, if any of us roll out analytics and papers start running stories about our institutions being creepy and following students, invading their privacy, you know, we all know how bad news that will be. So the whole surveillance, big data, creepiness thing is definitely an issue, and that's really about social norms. And no one knows what the answer is. You just got to try stuff out in a safe way. So I don't know, that may go some way to addressing this issue. You know, as we are able to visualize more and more of a student's life, what you show about yourself with respect to other students could be considered unacceptable or highly motivating.
I think we've just got time for one last question from John at the back.
Hi. Do you have any information on how students react to getting formative feedback on a piece of work generated by a machine? And are there any differences between maths, science, arts, humanities students?
Well, we know from intelligent tutoring systems that students will engage with them and do very well with them. Maybe it's easier with harder topics than softer topics. So if you're arts, humanities, social sciences, philosophy, etc., you know, notions of truth and plausibility are somewhat different. And having a machine come back to you and tell you that you're not sounding plausible, or that you can't put a good argument together, might be considered more controversial than saying, Simon, you really don't understand cosine, right? Which I'm more likely to take, right? Than, Simon, you really don't know how to write a coherent argument. The writing technology stuff is really interesting, given that so much of our student data and assessment is done through writing. Well, you saw Simon talking this morning about the Hewlett Challenge. Stuff's taking off, right? Turnitin have just bought Lightside Labs, who do automated formative feedback on school-age writing, right? So they are moving from being you're a bad person, you're plagiarizing, to we now want to use our massive installed base to start providing formative, constructive feedback to tell you how to improve your writing, not just slap you on the wrists, right? So this technology is becoming mainstream now. You know, for UTS, this is an R&D program, but we have every intention, if we get success, working closely with academics who deeply understand what good writing looks like in their discipline. That will go mainstream if it's working. You know, that's the exciting thing. We've got the capacity to do research, validate it, and then scale it up if we need, if it's looking promising. And we will do so because students are telling us they value it. You know, how else will a student get rapid, formative, personalized feedback on their writing without machines? Can't be done.
I think there's no better point to end than on that slightly controversial note. So, Simon, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating session, a real inspiration to us. Thank you.
Thank you.